Thank you for joining us today. This is the SubRosa News Program. I'm Dan Garrity. This episode is being recorded on Friday, April 3rd in Sacramento, California, the capital of the Golden State. Thanks again for listening to us on the various platforms where it is distributed. We do appreciate your time to listen to this. Today, we're going to discuss something that comes up in the media, particularly conservative media, quite often, and that is how California is portrayed, the entire state. If you were to listen to Fox News or Newsmax or any of the other conservative outlets, California is painted as this wildly liberal and progressive state. So let's acknowledge a few things before we begin this discussion. First, we will acknowledge that there are no statewide Republican office holders since Arnold Schwarzenegger left the governorship. Since that time, there have been no senators and none of the constitutional office holders as a Republican in the state of California. So it's important to note that. Also, in the California State Assembly and the State Senate, the Democratic Party enjoys supermajorities. So California is a Democratic state, and it has become a Democratic state in the last 30 years, and you can say it's blue. While California is liberal and democratic, is it really progressive? I'd argue no, it is not a progressive state, especially in the way it's portrayed in conservative media. So to examine this, we're going to go back in time 32 years ago actually, to 1994. And I think this is where this story really begins and where my argument will begin. 1994 to some of our listeners might seem a lifetime ago and might be longer than you've been on the face of the earth. But for somebody that gets up in age like myself, 30 years ago really is pretty quick. So you need to keep that in mind. But 1994 was a seminal year in American and California politics. Nationally, that was the year that the Republicans, following Republican Congressman Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. It was a seismic change. It really was. That same year, there were a couple propositions on California's ballot that had long-lasting effects in the state. Now, it did, one of these specifically did help California move from being a moderate, a mixed state, if you will. Keep in mind that California had two governors, starting with George DeMajian and then Pete Wilson, who held the governorship for 16 years straight after the two terms of Jerry Brown. So there was a Republican history in the state. That all changed in 1994 when Governor Pete Wilson, he was facing a legitimate challenge from Kathleen Brown as he sought his second term in office. So what did Pete Wilson do? He came up with the infamous Proposition 187. And 187, which was called Save Our State, was a ballot measure championed by Wilson that would have, it actually did pass, but had it been implemented, it would have denied undocumented immigrants access to public education, non-emergency health care, and social services. It would have required state and local agencies, including teachers and healthcare workers, to verify immigration status, and it would have mandated reporting of suspected, undocumented individuals to federal authorities. This sound familiar to you at all? This was really MAGA way before Donald Trump became visible on the political scene. But Pete Wilson used this hate, if you will, put it on the ballot, and lo and behold, you know what happened? It was approved by 59% of California voters. Think about that. 59% of California voters 32 years ago approved a MAGA-type proposition before the word MAGA even existed. Now, there's a flip side to 187 too. In the aftermath of 187, there was just a wild outpouring of anger, particularly from the Latino and immigrant community. As a result of that, it spurred many Latinos and other legal immigrants who were here legally to seek their citizenship and vote. And that really did change the statewide dynamics, and it moved California from being kind of a mixed state between Republicans and Democrats more towards the Democratic side. The other thing that happened in 1994 was there were two things, and this was California's infamous pursuit of the three strikes law. In the 90s, nationally and here in California, there was a lot of chatter and a lot of concern about law and order. So what California did, and it was at the vanguard of this, and many states ultimately followed California's lead. The first thing that happened was the Assembly Bill 971 in 1994. It was the so-called three strikes bill. It passed. It had 72% overall in that was I'm getting ahead of myself. It passed the legislature, and it was enacted before Proposition 184 appeared on the November 1994 ballot. Proposition 184, which was a parallel action to the legislative action from Assembly Bill 971, had 72% approval by California voters. Think of that. 3/4 of the people who went out and voted for tougher sentencing laws and life, in some cases, life sentences for a third felony. And of course, as we learned in several years later, there were all sorts of unintended consequences from that legislation. It disproportionately targeted minority, Latino, black communities, and it had a devastating effect on families and communities in there. Now, I think most people would agree if you do a crime, you should do the time. But California's three strikes was so heavy-handed that it had long-lasting effects. And we'll see one of those effects here a little bit later in our discussion. So 1994 was really a very critical year in the state of California. You had 187, which was the pre-MAGA, anti-immigrant initiative pushed by former Governor Pete Wilson. And then there was the Get Tough on Crime, the three strikes law, and then the Proposition 184. If you look at it through that prism, California really was not very progressive. And you may argue, well, times have changed. It's a fair argument, but let's continue on our examination of some of these things. The next thing that came up, and it didn't have to do with crime or immigration per se, but this was a conservative-backed bill, and it had wide-ranging effects on Californians. And I'm speaking of the Deregulation Act of 1996, Assembly Bill 1890. It was signed into law by Pete Wilson in 1996, and the goal was to dismantle the traditional monopoly model where utilities own everything from the power plants to the wires in your neighborhood. And on paper, it kind of sounded good, but you got to remember who was backing this bill. Always look at the money. Among the backers of the bill were Pacific Gas and Electricity, Southern California Energy, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And we're going to pull another name out from the past that I'm sure many of our listeners will relate to and they'll recall, and that was Enron. Enron helped push this bill through the state Senate and the Assembly. And this is the amazing part. If California was so progressive, how did it pass in both houses, in both chambers, unanimously? There was not a single vote against it. So this passed in 1996, signed into law, and within a couple years, lo and behold, what happens in California? California starts having energy shortages. And as we come to learn, this was just pure market manipulation by the companies like Enron. You know, we had rolling blackouts. Does anybody recall those? We had rolling blackouts. It wasn't because there was a shortage of electricity per se, but rather there was market manipulation by Enron really to line their pockets. And as we learned, not long after this, during the second Bush administration, the second George Bush administration, that is, Enron were nothing but a bunch of crooks. But they managed to get this law enacted in California that just lined their pockets. Wasn't there one Bernie Sanders in the state legislature at that time? Really? I mean, how can this have passed? If California was such a progressive place, wouldn't at least one person have thrown their hand up and say, this is wrong? It didn't happen. And, this is part of my argument. California is not as progressive as they are portrayed, particularly in the media. It's liberal, it's democratic, it's not progressive. That was, in the 90s, those three things, Prop 187, Prop 184, and then Assembly Bill 1890, really determined much of what happened for the next several years in California. And 187 in particular, we'll go back to that, did, and we do have to acknowledge that changed the overall state dynamics with the party, with the Democratic Party basically having a stranglehold. But just because you're in the Democratic Party does not mean, A, that you're liberal, for one thing, or B, especially in Part B here, that you're progressive. It just does not entirely relate. Let's move forward to the next big event that I argue shows that California is not as progressive as it's portrayed. And that has to do with Proposition 8 in 2008. Now, Proposition 8 was put on the ballot after gay marriage was legalized in the state of California. It was legalized, and a large group of people, and really a interesting assortment of people, got together and put this ballot on this measure on the November 2008 ballot. It was led by the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and many black church leaders, of course, evangelicals and Roman Catholics bought into the plan. And they campaigned vigorously to overturn and reverse gay marriage in California. Now, granted, this didn't have the widespread support that 187 did or 194, but it did pass. It ultimately passed in the state of California. Of course, it was challenged in courts, and the courts reversed it, and by 2013, gay marriage had returned to California. And then, of course, the 2015 Supreme Court decision legalized gay marriage nationwide. But 2008 isn't that long ago. You know, we're talking about, 18 years ago? It just really wasn't that long ago. And there were enough Californians who said, no, gay people should not be allowed to enter into a marriage. Essentially a civil contract is what a marriage is in the eyes of the law. Now, if we were in a truly progressive state then, that wouldn't, first of all, it probably wouldn't have even qualified for the ballot. It qualified for the ballot. The organizers gathered their signatures and got it placed, which is everybody's right in the state of California and nationally for that matter. But if we were so progressive, would it have passed by 52% of the voters? I just don't think so. I cannot believe that in 2008, California would have been classified as a progressive place. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to bring up a few other propositions and things that happen in California that I hope convince you that California is not as progressive as the right-wing media states. Well, thanks for staying with us. We're back from break now, and we'll continue our discussion on my argument that California isn't as progressive as portrayed in the media. Now, when Gavin Newsom was elected to the governorship in 2018, one of his main campaign promises was he would bring a single-payer healthcare system to the state of California. And the short version of that is that has not happened. Gavin Newsom, for any variety of reasons, some say it was the cost, some say it was pressure from the unions who didn't want to forsake their members' health care benefits. Regardless of the reason, that idea has disappeared from the California discussion. There has been no legitimate proposal brought forward that would create a single-payer system in California. The single-payer system is a progressive dream, if you will. Many people on the progressive side of politics often talk about a single-payer system or Medicare for all if you're looking at it on a national basis. But in California, Gavin Newsom made the promise. It helped ensure he won the governorship after being lieutenant governor for 2 terms under former Governor Jerry Brown. But Newsom has largely abandoned it. Now, Newsom will be out of office in about 7-8 months when his term ends, and he's already laying markers and laying the groundwork for a presidential run. Expect to see this come back, and he's going to get attacked from both sides on this. If he ultimately becomes the Democratic nominee, which I don't think he will, but let's say he does, the Republicans and conservatives and MAGA world are going to attack him for bringing up and suggesting a single-payer system. Conversely, during the primaries, I think Newsom is vulnerable to the fact that he promised a single-payer system, which is high on the list of the high to-do list for many progressives, and he has failed to deliver. He will be attacked, I am certain, on his position on that. If California was, going back to Newsom's proposition for a single payer system, if the Assembly, the California State Assembly and the California State Senate were as progressive as they are portrayed, that would have been discussed widely. There may have been some committee discussions in the last few years since Newsom became governor, but it didn't go any further than that, even if they did happen. If California was so progressive, wouldn't we have already established under Gavin Newsom, who, let's not forget, he legalized gay marriage in the city of San Francisco when he was mayor, long before other states and municipalities legalized such moves. If we were so progressive, wouldn't Newsom have pushed for this? And wouldn't the assembly members and the state senators, the Democrats who control both houses, wouldn't they have pushed this much harder? I argue if they were true progressives, they would have. And, so the reverse argument comes up. They are not true progressives. And California is not a true progressive state. So let's move on to one other proposition that I want to discuss, and this one is more recent. That would be Proposition 36. Proposition 36 was put on the ballot in 2024, and it had the backing of big business, not surprising. It had the backing of many moderate Democrats, including San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan, who is running for governor, although he's not polling very well, and he probably will not make it out of the primary. Many Democratic smaller city mayors. And what Proposition 36 did, and this is really interesting, I think, and this goes to my argument. Proposition 36 pushed back reforms, criminal justice reforms, like Proposition 47, which was passed in 2014 by a majority of California voters, that actually rolled back some of the harsher elements of the three-strike penalty. So California did acknowledge ultimately that the three strikes was not working as intended. There were all sorts of negative consequences to it. Voters, to their credit, and maybe this is one instance where there is some progressiveness with California voters, agreed, we need to reduce the sentencing on this. We need to reform it. Proposition 47 passed. Now, running parallel to the prison sentencing reform was the growth in homelessness in California. They kind of collided and formed Proposition 36 in 2024. Many of the crimes being committed in 2020, up to 2024, were from homeless and unhoused individuals. What Proposition 36 did was roll back some of the criminal justice reforms from Prop 47, and it strengthened penalties for repeat theft, and certain drug-related offenses. Now, Governor Newsom did not back Prop 36, but it did have the backing of many moderate Democrats within the state. And it got on the ballot, and of course, it passed. And what was the percentage passing? Let me check here. It was 65% of voters approved Proposition 36. Proposition 36, and this is the ironic part of it, it was approved, overwhelmingly approved, and of course it had strong support from the law enforcement community, law enforcement unions, key word there, unions, and the public was basically, in my opinion, hoodwinked. And the reason I say they were hoodwinked is because it made a lot of promises, but none of the promises have been fulfilled to what they thought they should be or what they could be because it's unfunded. There was no money attached to this. In my opinion, this was more of a symbolic gesture to California voters who were clearly irritated by the repeat retail theft that was going on. And it was going on. There's no denying that. But they came up with a solution, but they didn't fund it. It was not funded. So Proposition 36 is in law, but it's not being used. So even if you supported it, and most voters did, there's no funding for it. In my mind, that was just a ploy by politicians to say they're doing something. But the bigger portion of it is it rolled back criminal justice reforms, Prop 47, that were needed. Nothing's really happened on that. There's no funding. And I want to make one final argument about California not being as progressive as it is portrayed, or as some people think. And this has to do with sales taxes. Now, if you know anything about tax theory, a sales tax is a regressive tax. A regressive tax is a tax that penalizes poor people and lower income individuals because it's a flat percentage. Some of California's municipalities are tacking on sales taxes to the statewide sales taxes to fund their various projects. Now, you can have a whole discussion about California's income tax and property tax system because it's a unique system. But in this one narrow case, voters consistently approve sales taxes, particularly municipal sales taxes. And in some California municipalities and counties, that rate is up to 10%. Now, it doesn't, in California, sales tax don't apply to groceries. So there is some saving grace to that. But if you're a family and you need to buy a car, and you live in a jurisdiction that has 10% sales tax, no matter where you buy the car, you are taxed based on your residency. And that adds a substantial cost. It's a regressive tax. And as we all know, regressive is the opposite of progressive. There you have my arguments on why I believe California is not a progressive state politically as much as the media claims. Would I like it to be more progressive? Absolutely, I would. I would like to see the state, if the federal government doesn't do it, and by all indications it will not, take more progressive stances on a variety of issues, particularly health care. And I'll make this one last point. There's kind of one thread through all of these that influence Californians, and that's the influence of big money. For example, on the three strikes law, that was backed by the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, prison guards, and police unions. They profit from having these tough on law bills. And I'm not just saying reasonable, unnecessarily tough bills. But the reason they want it is because it gives more work for their membership. And they have a very strong lobby in California, not only with the Republicans, but more importantly, the Democratic majority. Money runs through all of this. And until money is removed from politics in any meaningful manner, be it in your local election, statewide election, or national election, there will never be a true progressive reforms in the United States. Thanks for listening to us, and we hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think.